Welcome to Echo Greenfield, a project of local access to Valley Arts, and to this special program on the Underground Railroad in Greenfield. This is a first for us of a kind of a hybrid presentation. We have a group on Zoom and we have a live audience at the Lava Center. So half of the project team, Doug Selwyn and I, are holding down the Zoom end in our house, and Vanessa Query and Lindy Whiten, who's the project director, are holding down the Lava Center end of things. A little bit about Echo Greenfield. It is, first of all, it's funded by a grant from Mass Humanities, so we always want to thank them a whole lot for that. It is a local history project, and it's organized around the idea that we are surrounded by histories, both visible and invisible, that impact our lives pretty much every day, whether we're thinking about it or not. We are also both eyewitnesses to history and creators of history, because each of us is living our own lives in the context of history with important things that we've lived through, we've witnessed, and that we have stories to tell about. So you can learn more about us at echogreenfield.org, excuse me, and hopefully you'll get involved one way or another. We've been doing a series of programs at the Lava Center since, actually since very late June. And we are slowly but surely getting those digitalized and up on the website. So within about a week, you should be able to see several of the sessions on the Echo Greenfield website. And that will allow you to go back and hear other presentations that you've missed that perhaps you would like to have been part of had you known in time. There are a combination of activities that we've done, explorations with our small core group on key kinds of skills about investigating history, and also guest speakers who have brought some important content information to us. So check out our website frequently. It'll be changing, growing all the time. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Joan Featherman to you. She served as project director for the Road to Freedom grant, 2006 to 7, that she's going to be telling us about today. She was, at the time of the grant, the chair of the Greenfield Human Rights Commission and had been a former school committee member. She's also a singer with Amandla, which is now Fiery Hope Chorus. In her career, Dr. Featherman has been a founding member of several effective, enduring social change organizations, including NELQUIT and the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, among others. She is a Greenfield resident for over 35 years and is currently a psychologist in private practice in Greenfield. Thank you so much, Joan Featherman, for being with us today and for presenting your information to us. So I will turn it over to you. I will unpin myself and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Jan, and everyone at the Lava Center. And thank all of you for coming to continue uncovering the story of the Underground Railroad and anti-slavery activity in Greenfield in the 1800s and before and since. Your presence here makes you part of a robust network of historians and educators, scholars, and activists who are inspired by this area of study and committed to keeping this history alive, which is all about what the Mass Humanities Foundation is about, is bringing history to life. And when we do that, we join with each other and we join with diverse communities represented in that history. So I'm hoping that by the end of this talk, you will feel the same kind of passion I feel to continue studying this history, because it's so relevant in our daily lives now. I'll be talking about our local Underground Railroad project, which was planned and implemented in 2006 and 2007. That's 14 years ago. So forgive me if I don't remember every single detail from what was a pretty complex project. We had funding from the Mass Humanities and other sources as well, a lot of in-kind contributions. And I hope this talk gives you a springboard to continue some type of work on this topic. The Underground Railroad is a story that inspires us, reminds us that hope and resilience and loving community have prevailed over the centuries, despite the horrific evils and trauma of slavery, Jim Crow, and persisting systemic racism. And in our current times, that's so relevant to know this history and know where we came from as a community. There's a lot of information contained in the handouts, and I encourage you to read them at your leisure. I'm not going to read from them much to you, so you can take them with you and get more details after this workshop. The handouts are a mix of posters for events, newspaper articles, original documents from the 1800s, artwork from the 1800s, and event programs. I've also included some pages from the actual grant, including the budget, for those of you who may feel motivated after this to decide to write a grant and fund a project of your own that's related. Part of our strategy was to bring this history into the everyday lives of a broad-based community, a kind of a saturation, which you can see in this small sample of our press releases and other advertising. And what you have in front of you is really a small sample. I'll show you a couple of recorder headlines about the project. This one is dated February 2nd, 2007. This one, I love it when we get the headlines, is from April 2007. I'll summarize the process of bringing this big idea into the reality of a substantial grant and a successful series which explored this important local history, connecting it to wider social justice issues of that time, the 1800s, and to the related issues that we still grapple with today. I'll summarize each program in the 10-part series. And as I said, I hope you'll read more about them in the handouts. Now, when you apply to the Mass Foundation for the Humanities, they require you to identify scholars for the grant. And to me, that word sort of morphed into who are the human resources in our community who already know a lot about this issue. Those resources, and I'll be reading you a list later on of the principals in the grant, they continue, most of them, to be resources. So if you leave here today deciding, oh, I want to do X on the Underground Railroad, call up one of them, email one of them, ask them for their advice, ask them for information that they have, because our area is rich with people who are grounded in this history. While our project explored history guided by the grant, it was also about story. And Carol, I'm glad, Jan, I'm glad you referenced the idea of story. Story is narrative, both on an individual and a collective level. And when you explore this kind of history, you're not looking only for the original documentation and things you can say, this was true. You're looking for the narrative. You're looking for the stories about people's lives and experiences, some of which are passed down generation to generation. And my contention is that's as true and relevant as the hard and fast factual evidence from original documents. And so part of the spirit in me sharing these stories with you today is the idea that sharing stories connects us. As a psychologist, I'm very interested in story, how our past, our families, the social context, our experiences affect who we are and how we live and how we connect, as I said. So I'm going to start with my personal story, which brings me to this commitment to this work. And as we used to say in the 70s in the women's movement, the personal is political. And that is one of the themes that I bring. So in the 50s and 60s, there I was, suburban Massachusetts, sitting in front of my very small black and white TV screen, watching the civil rights marches in the South, voter registration marches, desegregation marches. And unfortunately, they came with also watching the shameless brutality of law enforcement, politicians, and white citizens, such as those in the Ku Klux Klan. With the fire hoses and the police dogs, and the brutality awakened in me, and this was elementary school, a sense of outrage which has never left me. We have to know that history to understand where we are today with the epidemic of hate in our society and racism, white supremacy. And we need, I've always allowed my outrage to fuel this kind of productive activity that leads to social change. So as a teenager, my outrage continued to grow, and I needed to channel it in some way that was permissible in my family. And so I became a folk singer, and I sang protest music. And I protested lots of things in those days, and I suppose I still do. I remember in 1964, my high school graduation speech. I don't remember much of it, but I do remember the opening lines. It began with liberty and justice for all. Liberty and justice, except for those whose skins are not white. This was not something talked about at that time and in that community. In the 70s, I learned to build effective social justice organizations at the local, state, and national levels in the battered women's movement. This work involved changing the public narrative about violence against women, changing laws, getting funding, networking with allies, educating the public. The practical skills I learned in those years served me well in organizing this Underground Railroad project. So fast forward again, it's January 2006. I am chair of the Greenfield Human Rights Commission. We are sitting around discussing, it's January, so we're sitting around discussing what to do for Black History Month, floating various ideas. Nothing seems like enough. It just so happened that I had gotten an email from Mass Humanities with their grant cycle, which had a realistic deadline, and one of their grants was entitled With Liberty and Justice for All. Oh my God, okay. So I brought this to the commission, and we took a leap of faith, and we created a 2-year project, a year of planning and a year of implementation, which was ambitious and multifaceted. My belief has always been that, as I said before, I think making this history come alive is the affirmation that we have always been a multiracial community seeking liberty and justice for all, contrary to what some people were saying at that time. So the core of the design had to do with building a community of educators, historians, activists, and scholars. Getting the money allowed us to be creative and set big goals. So we designed a series of 10 different kinds of events with the final project of a walking tour of Underground Railroad and anti-slavery sites, resulting from the scholarly research with original documents that was done in the course of the grant. So again, and I'll come back to this, I want to emphasize your big idea can get funded. You find the right kind of funding source and you figure out how to navigate between your mission and their mission. So this is what we did. Here are the nuts and bolts. First, we assembled co-sponsors. This was in advance of applying for the grant because of course we had to get the grant. So our co-sponsors were, besides the Human Rights Commission, the Greenfield Historical Commission, and the Pioneer Valley Institute affiliated with GCC. We had to be strategic about the language of the grant. And let me just, I kind of did up this Venn diagram. So here's the lens of the Humanities Foundation, and here's the social justice lens that we who were writing this grant that were coming from. And this overlap here is where we had to find the language to successfully get the grant. And here's an example of how we navigated that. As an Amandla singer who had been singing the music of the Underground Railroad for many years, I wanted to do a concert. And Humanities Foundation was very clear with me, we don't fund performances. Okay, let's not let that stop us. So we created a whole program in which, with the middle school students, creating a chorus and an educational opportunity over a 2-month period, and in which we embedded a public performance where the kids got to sing with our chorus. So it was, you know, meeting in the middle with the grantor. So we always wanted this to be a broad-based community project. And in that light, the first thing we did during the planning phase was we reached out to the community. And look at your first handout called The Road to Freedom. I just want to say that the artwork you'll find on all the handouts is artwork that comes from the era of the Underground Railroad. So this was, as you see, this was May 2006, and we widely publicized this planning meeting open to everyone in the community. We got a great turnout. We had newsprint all around the room and markers, and brainstormed and came out with a hefty list of people who already knew a lot and had done a lot of work on the Underground Railroad. So we assembled a team of planners, grant writers, and the people that offered the workshops. This next handout, which you can see, is the final grant report and the list of activities with attendance and budget. And that was, I include that again for those of you who might decide to write a grant. This was from the final report to Mass Humanities. In building this list of scholars, resources, it was very important to us that everybody's contribution be recognized on an equal basis. And, the grant was very hierarchical in the sense of who was a scholar in their eyes. But in our eyes, a scholar was anyone that was committed to this work and was prepared to work on it. So this list that I'm going to quickly read to you is not exhaustive, because I would say there were 50 to 100 people who had some role in bringing all these activities into being. So I just want to talk a little bit about the role of project director. I think it was a very good thing for us that the Human Rights Commission, i.e. the town of Greenfield, was the applicant for the grant. It meant for us that we had access to the town accountant and to other town services that meant we didn't have to bill. We didn't have to send checks out. We didn't have to manage the money. That was very helpful. So we could concentrate on content. And both the Historical Commission and the Human Rights Commission are arms of government. So the project director role, and I bet that Lindy at Echo Greenfield and at the Lava Center, this is what she does in her role as project director. And it involves a lot of hours. It includes organizing and facilitating meetings, networking resource people, facilitating information flow, participating in program development and implementation. And it just is keeping all the moving pieces going forward. Doris Doyle was a Greenfield Human Rights Commission. Her plan was to work with Denise Petrin, a teacher at the Greenfield Middle School, in organizing a community reads program with relevant literature. Cynthia Herbert was the director of the Pioneer Valley Institute, a program devoted to exploring the history, culture, and geography of the Pioneer Valley. And she was a member of the pre-existing Underground Railroad Project Coordinating Committee. Great resource. Luanza Lett Brewington is an oral historian, a griotess, storyteller, and educator. She blends the drama of theater and mystique of oral history to portray the lives of slaves, former slaves, and activists throughout African American history. Eveline McDougall, my dear friend, director of the Amandla Community Chorus, now called Fiery Hope. She served as music director of the after-school program at Greenfield Middle School, creating a rich, multifaceted learning environment. Bambi Miller and Mary Bomer, librarians from Charlemont, who had done a lot of work in general on Underground Railroad sites in Charlemont, and also on the notion of quilting as related to the Underground Railroad. And I'll be talking more about that. I mentioned Denise Petrin, teacher, social studies and language arts teacher, and she had applied for a teaching tolerance grant to further this learning for her students. Louise Minks, an incredible resource, artist and Underground Railroad educator, who I think she did 4 different events, including an art exhibit of her life-size portraits of African Americans from the era of the Underground Railroad to the present. Marcia Starkey was the chair of the Greenfield Human Rights Commission. And Jill Ogline was our scholar from UMass, a researcher from the Department of History, PhD candidate, and she worked with Marcia Starkey and Louise Minks. They worked together on the academic research, uncovering the sites, and then writing the walking tour brochure that lists all the sites and the stories and documentation they were able to come up with. Diane Clancy and Susan Elkin, who contributed to the arts and photography for the walking tour brochure. Momadou Sarr, diversity educator, who was a human rights commissioner. And in fact, the entire Human Rights Commission worked on this in one way or another. And I would have to thank the mayor at the time, Chris Forgy, and the town of Greenfield for fully supporting this project. The Amandla Chorus and performers at our performance the chorus went to the middle school, large numbers of them, twice a week for 2 months, to embrace these students learning the history and the music and propping them up for their first public performance. I have to thank the Franklin County Jail print shop, which is where we got this brochure printed. Carlin Saltman, volunteer videographer, who made a wonderful DVD of the performance, which I will talk a little bit more about later. Sandy Thomas, amateur historian par excellence, very knowledgeable about John and Julia Putnam, some of our most noted early Black residents. And I'll be talking more about them later also. Andy Wallace, a 10th grade teacher at the Four Rivers Charter School, who got a grant to create a website of original documents related to the Underground Railroad by his students. Lindley Wilson, also a human rights commissioner, who teaches the history and construction of quilts to students of all ages at the Patuxent Valley Memorial Association. So now I'm going to talk to you about the programs, and the first Louise Mink's handout. And there are two sides to this. The first event of the series was called In Pursuit of Freedom. And this was a participatory presentation with original documents. It was held at the Charlemont Library because they had done such a lot of work documenting Underground Railroad sites. And in fact, they had received federal recognition and a plaque to put on one of their sites. So here is Louise's art on this poster. The next side, the other side of this poster, is one of the newspaper articles. And what we did in that workshop was Louise handed out name tags and we hung them around our necks. The names were of people living in Boston in the 1850s who were involved in the Underground Railroad. Then she handed out original documents and we related them to the characters that we were holding. And it was very powerful. There were a lot of high school students there as well as adults. And it was a good kickoff event for us. The next presentation Louise did was essentially a curriculum panel for the teachers at the Greenfield Middle School. And she presented original documents and asked teachers to share their curriculum ideas. And I have to say that we always did evaluations at the end of our events, and a number of teachers said it was the best curriculum panel they had attended on the Underground Railroad. And so that was very gratifying. And on this handout, you'll see an original document, which was about the idea that slave catchers were, even this far north, would come to look and kidnap escaped slaves and bring them back to where they escaped from. And again, they, back in those times, it wasn't that easy to communicate widely. So they had broadsides and posters, and churches played a big role in disseminating this information. So this was a warning to keep us an eye out for the kidnappers. The other side of this handout, you don't you can read it later. It's more notices about the upcoming events, and we always kept ahead of the events so people had plenty of time to plan their time. This image, Am I Not a Man and a Brother? This was called the Wedgwood Medallion, and it was designed in the late 1700s. So the Wedgwood Medallion, and in a future handout, you'll see one depicting a woman, an enslaved woman as well. This one was mounted in settings and worn in combs, ties, bracelets, and other items of dress, and sold as a way to raise funding for the anti-slavery movements. The balance sheet you see are the contributions made to this. I believe this is a chapter of the Boston Anti-Slavery Society, and you see who's donating money. And women were very active in raising money for abolitionist efforts. You see the New Bedford Female Union, the Upton Ladies, Middlesex County, etc. And there were many such balance sheets like that, which provided documentation. And here's a notice of, this was, I think, an annual report from the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. Again, feel free to read this at your leisure. This is a piece of artwork related to the Underground Railroad by Louise Minks, and she had made this painting a number of years before our project, called Breaking the Chains. And her message was very much about the collaboration between the white community and the Black community in working against slavery. And that was an important point to articulate the leadership of Black citizens. And then you see the other medallion, Am I Not a Woman and a Sister? And that appeared on items like the Wedgwood Medallion and acted like our bumper stickers today. But this appeared on sugar bowls and sewing bags and other household items, which were available to a wide range of ordinary people to raise support and to raise money. This is an anti-slavery tract called No Slave Hunting in the Old Bay State. And this was an appeal to the people and legislature of Massachusetts, 1860. And I love that on the title page of this is a snippet from a poem by a J.G. Whittier that says, "For us and for our children, the vow which we have given for freedom and humanity is registered in heaven. No slave hunt in our borders, no pirate on our strand, no fetter in the Bay State, no slave upon our land." The history of our very blue state. Now we go to a couple of quilting presentations. Now, let me talk a little bit about the idea of the relationship between quilts and the Underground Railroads. And this is one of those places where story and history might be indistinguishable from each other. The common wisdom is that quilts were used to tell stories of the Underground Railroad, that there were clues on the quilts for the routes for people to follow, that they could be hung in a window or not to communicate it's safe to go tonight or it's not safe to go tonight. So Bambi Miller and Mary Bomer in period costumes, lovely, with an array of artifacts from the 1800s, including some of those sewing bags and sugar bowls and that sort of thing. It was very compelling. They talked about the local residents who sheltered, supported, and integrated African-American families seeking freedom from slavery into their lives. They presented their community quilt projects, where community groups made Underground Railroad quilts to raise funding for Charlemont's petition to designate a local station on the Underground Railroad as an historic site. And then Hearts and Hands to Cloth by Lindley Wilson and Bambi and Mary as well, trace the development and traditions of quilt making from Africa to contemporary African-American textiles, highlighting the role of quilts in the Underground Railroad. So needless to say, there were many quilters in the audience at these two presentations. And this one had a lot of very colorful slides, and the audience was totally enthralled. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the part of this project that I kind of started with because it's the musical connection. And it's how we brought the Underground Railroad music to the public, and also engaged with some wonderful young students ages 8 to 15, creating a chorus at the Greenfield Middle School. So here was our poster that got hung in the school to try to encourage kids to come. And I mean, one of the incredible things about at that time, I'm just going to call it the Amandla Chorus, was that we often brought people up who didn't know the music, but surrounded them with our chorus. And that is a wonderful way to learn music, choral music. And when the students first came to us, they were very shy. Some of them were singers, but some of them had never done anything like this before. But the whole process was about supporting them in their confidence and their sense that they could learn this music, but also learning about what the Underground Railroad and the anti-slavery activities really were and how they relate to some current day challenges that we have. This is a wonderful, one of the ways we helped them become more comfortable was, and the music department at the Greenfield Middle School was very helpful with this, bringing out all these drums. And they really went to town with the drums, and that went perfectly with the kind of music that it is. So we rehearsed twice a week for 2 months, as I said, and then we held 2 performances, one for all the students in the middle school, and then that evening for the general public, and it was very well attended. And let me read you a little bit from this press release announcing the concert. Come early to meet artist Louise Minks as she presents her African-American portrait series, but most of all, come to see the beautiful, shining young faces infused with joy and pride as they sing about freedom, justice, and the triumph of the human spirit over oppression and adversity. They are living proof that each one of us can be a force to make the world a better place. The next slide you'll see is the program that we put together for the concert. And as you see, we labeled it a concert in celebration of the human spirit. and included this artwork. The Ride for Liberty was a pretty famous painting of the time of an enslaved family on a horse making the run for freedom. Then there's Sojourner Truth, one of Louise Mink's portraits, and then a photograph of John Putnam, our most widely known Black resident. So next, we were lucky enough to get Carlin Saltman to make this DVD, and it contains all the music that we sang. And I'm going to sing you a couple of snippets, because the music of the Underground Railroad, like the Quilts, there's metaphor here. There's actual, when it's risky to organize, how do you get your message across anyway? So, for example, Follow the Drinking Gourd. Follow the drinking gourd, follow the drinking gourd, for the old man is a-waiting for to carry you to freedom. Follow the drinking gourd. So for the drinking gourd is, of course, the Big Dipper. So that was a nod towards, following the directions that were in the stars. And then there's wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. And that was a nod to don't leave your footprints or your scent for the dogs. Walk in the water instead. And then one more little thing about probably one of the most famous conductors on the Underground Railroad. Her name was Harriet Tubman, and she drove on the Underground Railroad. And so you can see the whole list of songs. This DVD exists, and it can be publicized. I just want to draw your attention to the photo on the front, that in addition to the music, and look at the bright faces of the students, we also had 2 performances by local historians and freedom fighters. Loanzalette Brewington did a living historical performance as in the character of Lucy Terry Prince, who was a freed slave who lived in South Deerfield and published a poem. I think I remember her saying it was the first published poem by a former slave. And then, of course, there's our own dear Juanita Nelson, who regaled the audience and the students with her stories of her activism in the civil rights movement and beyond. And it was a wonderful evening, and I will never forget it. Sandy Thomas spoke about John Putnam, and one of the songs, What Can One Little Person Do, was a nod to everybody can do something in this direction of freedom and justice. So, okay, now I'm going to talk about the research panel and the walking tour. As I said, the research was ongoing throughout all these activities. And they did a lot of library work and talking to people and reading. The booklet which was produced, describes the organization of the 93-member Franklin County Anti-Slavery Society in 1832. The group held a 2-day convention at the Methodist Episcopal Church at Hope and Main Streets. The State Anti-Slavery Society was formed the next year. And the 12-page guide and map identifies 16 town buildings and sites associated with the movement, including one on the east end of Main Street and one on the west end. And as I've been talking to people about this presentation, clearly more research has been done and more sites have been identified. And maybe we need a second edition of this walking tour, just saying. So, okay, now let's go to the walking tour. Massachusetts abolitionists, this is on page 2, formed the world's first integrated anti-slavery organization, the New England Anti-Slavery Society. 2 goals: ending slavery at once and revolutionizing public opinion in regard to Black rights. By 1837, nearly 200 local societies dotted the landscape, including at least 13 in Franklin County. This is a hefty history. Then the local anti-slavery group, their first annual meeting at the Methodist Church was in 1838. And the board of directors drew up a series of anti-slavery petitions to Congress to be distributed to town societies for signing and submission. These regular petitions, predominantly signed and circulated by women, were a central element of the strategies of the Anti-Slavery Society. And that leads me to want to just say, there were divisions within the anti-slavery community, and they're divisions that we might expect today. What are the issues that are most important? Some of the anti-slavery societies absolutely linked women's suffrage with anti-slavery work and behaved accordingly. Others felt like, no, let's not include women's suffrage because it's going to turn some people against abolitionism. So thorny issues. There were, of course, those people like maybe myself today that want to do it all at once. But the history is spelled out in this pamphlet very nicely. Okay, so if you go to the map page of your walking tour, let me just highlight a couple of things. Number 6 on the map, which you can see, is on Bank Row. Dexter and Dexter and Eunice March house. And there is anecdotal accounts there of one of their children coming home one day and finding the yard full of Black children and having a wonderful time playing with them. And the next day they were not there. And when she said, "Where are the children?" she was told, "What children? There were no Black children here, and don't talk about it to anyone else." That seems like pretty compelling evidence of involvement in the Underground Railroad. By the way, this is the Dexter Marsh family responsible for finding the dinosaur fossils on Bank Road. Billy Elliot, his home at 473 Main Street, and let's see, that is number 2, was well known, evidently, as a frequent place of refuge for slaves fleeing from Southern captivity. And there's a little blurb in here about him. And one of the wonderful things in this pamphlet are the old photographs of downtown Greenfield. The Samuel Wells House, number 8, 1 Main Street, is a house that it's the western part of Main Street. The house was torn down, and the site is now in the parking lot of the auto dealership. But the story is that when they demolished that house, they found tunnels. There's some difference of opinion as to whether they were Underground Railroad tunnels from the railroad tracks, or perhaps a tunnel for supplies from the trains to the fort that was in Fort Square across the street. Charles and Emmeline Fisk, number 9, Main Street and Fisk Avenue. And you'll notice a lot of our streets are named for these people that were active during that time. Fisk was Charles Fisk's father was a great and early pioneer in the anti-slavery cause. This was written about in a book called The History of Greenfield, a frequent refuge of the fugitive slave in his search for freedom. Charles Devens, and you recognize Devens Street. Number 12, 70 Devens Street. It's a private residence. This is a very interesting story. He was a U.S. Marshal tasked with rounding up fugitive slaves. He couldn't tolerate the idea and felt forced to enforce the act. There was one particular fellow, Sims, who he captured, and he tried to buy Mr. Sims's freedom. He was turned down, but it's a compelling story. He later went on, Charles Devens, to assume a seat on the Massachusetts Supreme Court and served as U.S. Attorney General. And when he was in Washington as Attorney General, he got a job for Thomas Sims, who had finally escaped to permanent freedom. Wonderful story. Then there's the Levitt family. It's a big family with roots both in Charlemont and here. And the Levitt family, Jonathan Levitt and his wife, Emilia, bought a house, which is currently now the Greenfield Public Library, not for long, however. And there are many stories associated with this family about the relationships they had with slaves that had escaped slavery and come to this area and needed jobs, and he provided them with jobs. And he was active in anti-slavery activity, as was his son and his brothers. And I believe that his brother, who stayed in Charlemont, was the site that was designated as a historical site on the Underground Railroad in Charlemont. Washington Hall, there's a wonderful photograph next to the piece on Washington Hall. It served as the town hall. That's 16. It served as the town hall in the era. The picture we have is 1857, and it was a lecture hall, and a lot of famous people came to passionately address the evils of slavery and the quest for freedom, including Frederick Douglass, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Ralph Waldo Emerson. So abolitionism was preached here, often using highly dramatic oratorical techniques. The Coal Springs Baptist Church, which is not strictly an Underground Railroad site, except that the church itself, let's see where it's currently now the Zion Korean church next to the Y on Main Street. The church was moved to that site, but before it was moved, it was in Barre, Massachusetts, and that was another lecture hall where abolitionism was preached. I just want to show you the last page of the walking tour because this is the bibliography, and I'm hoping that you'll want to do more research on this. One of the books on the list is The Passages to Freedom, is a newer book published by Smithsonian called The Underground Railroad in History and Memory. This is a lovely book full of artwork and historical documents and photographs of people and places. That is a lovely book. There's a book not on that list that's called Bound for Canaan, The Underground Railroad and the War for the Soul of America. Sounds familiar. And that was published in 2005. So that was new when we did the grant. So here's the good news. There's going to be another walking tour of this site. It will be held October 9th. Carol Ailman, who is a researcher and a writer who is exploring the historical Black presence in Greenfield, and Luke Martin, Greenfield High School teacher of American history, including local Underground Railroad history, are conducting this walking tour in the next couple of weeks. So I'm really hoping some of you will decide to join them. And also Luke is going to be joined by one of his students from Greenfield High School, who he said is very knowledgeable about Underground Railroad related issues and very excited by it. Our grant was all about creating excitement for this topic and participation in uncovering it. So this brings me to our last major piece of the grant. And it wasn't strictly a part of the grant in that we didn't use grant funding for this project. What we did was we raised money instead, and it was this. And thank you, Sandy Thomas, for giving us this information. It turns out that John and Julia Putnam are buried in Greenfield, Green River Cemetery, but they didn't have a headstone. Why? We could ask ourselves why. I've seen it said that perhaps it was protective, that the gravestone not be vandalized. Who knows? Someone could look into that. But what we did was we raised money to place a headstone, and we combined that with the annual Putnam Fiddler Festival at the Energy Park and a reunion of Putnam descendants. And this handout and subsequent newspaper articles are all about John Putnam. Now, John Putnam, and many of you may know this, he was quite well known. He was a fiddler who performed at parties and events, and it was said that no party was complete without him playing the fiddle and leading the dancing. And lots of people say he was the father of the contradance community and the contradance movement that is so prevalent here in Greenfield. He was a barber, and anecdotal evidence, and this is listed in the walking tour, suggests that his house up on Wells Street, which no longer exists, had tunnels to the tracks and was a stop on the Underground Railroad. Sounds like someone could do more research on that. The next handout is the program we made for the dedication of the gravestone. By the numbers I was able to find, more than 40 Putnam descendants came. Some were local, but from all over the country, including his one of his great grandchildren, Juanita Harris King Latham, who was a gospel singer. And the last article you have about this takes place after the dedication and the Fiddler's Festival with Reunion, where the family members talk about how meaningful it was to have their ancestor be recognized and to feel like a part of this community. Because they had been here before. They had been here, I think, for the dedication or maybe the first annual Fiddler Festival. That might not be exactly true. Maybe it was the first or second. And I can show you a picture that I borrowed from Sandy Thomas. I hope you can see this, of the first Putnam family reunion. So at all our events, we had a little can that said Putnam Gravestone Project, and we sold these wonderful t-shirts made by Louise Minks that have her artwork, Breaking the Chains. And between the t-shirts and donations we got at our other 9 projects, we were able to purchase a headstone. Thank you, Negus and Taylor, for making that affordable for the money that we had. It just felt like it was an important culmination of this whole series to honor this important historical figure in our community. So, I loved this project. It was a wonderful thing. And I believe it was very successful. And I want to read you what our scholar said about it. And we had to make a final report, and the scholars had to evaluate the project. And she said, this project truly engaged members of the community. Events were well publicized and well attended, and media relations were handled effectively. I want to say a word about that. It's come to my attention that these days you wouldn't do media in the same way because you do social media. My sense is that the ECHO project uses social media very effectively. We had access to email, but in 2006 and 7, that's where we were limited, and we did a lot of print media and radio media and television as well. Project events and programs drew their approaches and themes from a wide variety of humanities, well integrating art, history, music, literature, and theater. So she gave us a very, very positive review here, and culminating in the walking tour. And I'm hoping again that some of you who are here today can take this up from where we left off, because there's more to be found. There's more to be discovered. And, it's very heartwarming. And it's such a wonderful antidote to the ugliness that we see in our culture right now, the racism, the ugliness. So yes, there's more work to do. It was not coincidental that in the spring of 2007, once we had had a few events widely publicized, there were 4 or 5 racist and anti-Semitic incidents, graffiti, verbal yelling, attacks, drive-by kind of things in Greenfield. And, you know, the fact that we kept going and kept making the points we were making and evoking the kind of multiracial community of justice that we were doing was a wonderful way to respond to that. So, my last piece is entitled Ideas for More Work That You Can Be Involved in. And this is not an exhaustive list, but you are interested enough in this topic to be here today. And I've always operated by the principle that if you have a good idea and it's about, and it's on the right side of things, if it's about pro-social, respectful community, anything's possible, including getting funding. So I'm just going to read the list that I put together, and you know, you might have more ideas, and I hope somebody who's here today takes some of these ideas and runs with them. Obviously, more research is needed to uncover more original documentation, local and regional. Because, you know, we weren't here operating in a vacuum. The routes from the South for escaped fugitives went through many, many states and many areas of the country. And every different areas have their own Underground Railroad history. Arrange for GCTV, who should still have a copy of the DVD of the performance, arrange for them to show it again. This is now 14 years ago, so I don't believe they've shown it recently, but embed it in a series on GCTV where local and regional Underground Railroad history is discussed. So you marry the two, the discussions of the history and what the performance offers in a way of making that history accessible. You could have a project where you produce signs in town marking the various sites on the walking tour. The way we did in the, I don't remember which decade it was, but all the signs around Greenfield that says it's against domestic violence, and they're posted all over town. That was a project that was funded and implemented, and we could do something like that about the Underground Railroad sites. There's the issue of Federal Register. I mean, I don't know if anyone is interested in that. Print, disseminate, and conduct more walking tours. Involve schools, involve libraries. Again, I would remind you that ECHO will be producing a walking tour in the next few weeks. Do a community reads program using literature from the Underground Railroad. And these days, there's a lot of good, I won't call it fiction, but it is anecdotal, such as Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. It's in the category of fiction, but there's truth to it. There's also some stuff that's not true, like in this book, the Underground Railroad is an actual train with tracks that was dug underground. You know, obviously unrealistic for the time, but very evocative in the novel. There's a book called Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. In that Underground Railroad narrative, there's a magical quality to how people get transported from slavery to freedom. This takes it even a little further away. There's a book called Underground Airlines, which is based on a premise that the Civil War never happened and that slavery was still legal in 4 states. And the narrator of the book is a former slave turned bounty hunter whose job it is to round up slaves. So, you know, is that historical? No, but it evokes passions and feelings about this topic. And these books are in the tradition, I think, of what Isabel Wilkerson, the author of Caste, which is a book I highly recommend, calls narrative nonfiction. So there's the nonfictional piece and there's the narrative anecdotal piece, which may be from wholly invented or stories passed down generation to generation. So I want to talk a little bit, I referenced the backlash that we got. And we got backlash in the early battered women's movement too, when we dared to say, no, you don't get to beat up your wives anymore. We won't tolerate it, and neither will the law, and neither will the state. And we redefined that whole thing. So we did get the backlash. And so the Human Rights Commission had a public hearing on unlearning hate, very well attended, very well designed. I would have liked more follow-up. It's the kind of thing you have to do once and then you do again to keep it in the public dialogue. And the more, you know, what I operate by is the more we get backlash, the more we know we're successful and the harder we work for justice. Couple other ideas. Make a community quilt. Do more visual art projects and performances about the Underground Railroad project. Here are a couple big ideas. Join the Human Rights Commission. There are currently 2 vacancies. Contact the mayor's office and indicate your desire to become a human rights commissioner. Join one of the many excellent local social justice organizations and bring this content into on the Underground Railroad and anti-slavery history, bring it into ongoing present discussions. Some of those organizations, Racial Justice Rising, the Interfaith Council, Black Lives Matter, Nelquit, individual churches and synagogues, and many other individuals and groups are doing social justice work. They need to know this history to understand the present dynamics as well. How about this one? An Underground Railroad Museum. That's a big one. Lots of funding needed for that, but worth talking about. And if you are interested in something like that, connect with the folks in Florence and Northampton on the Sojourner Truth Memorial Committee. Collaborate regionally. As I say, big ideas. So for me, committing to social justice work is at its core about the imperative of speaking up to injustice. Speaking up again and again and again, because it's not so easy to change things that are unjust. So in ending, I would like to read you a short poem that I think evokes that sense of the imperative I and probably many of you feel to work against injustice and to work for liberty and justice for all. And this is the poem this version is inscribed in the New England Holocaust Memorial in Boston by Pastor Martin Niemöller. They came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time, there was no one left to speak up. And that embodies the moral obligation we have in our multiracial, justice-seeking community to continue to work for a community that is equitable and just for everybody. So that is the end of my talk for today. I would love it if any of you have any comments or questions.
So Joan, was the local station on the Underground Railroad in Charlemont actually designated as an historic house? Was it the Levitt House? That's a question from Carol Ailman.
I believe it was a Levitt brothers house. And again, if you want more details about their research and how they went about getting that federal designation on the historic register, contact Bambi Miller or Mary Bomer at the Charlemont Library.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you, Marcia, for posing the question. Joan had sort of answered it, so I didn't
Okay.
want to press it.
I didn't, yeah. I didn't know.
Anyone else have a question or a comment?
Thank you, Joan. That was wonderful. Really looking forward to the walking tour.
Oh, good. I'm really
Wow.
glad.
Your project was just about 2 years before we moved here. So unfortunately, yeah. So it's great to hear about it. So,
Good.
Okay, well, I think this is an incredibly perfect example, really, of what the Echo Greenfield principles kind of embody and aim, which is it's a beautiful example of how it is both known and unknown history.
Mhm.
It's history that should be more known. It's history that impacts our lives every day, whether we are aware of it or not. When we walk down the streets of our own town, we may be walking on streets
Devon
that
Street or
that
Fisk
were-
Street, right?
right, that were either key to the good parts of our history or the less good parts of our history, but we probably don't know them much. So
Yeah.
there's just, that's what Echo Greenfield is all about, is let's uncover those histories, and let's also realize that we are making those histories right now as we live and breathe. Once again, Joan, thank you so much for this presentation. Thank you to everybody on Zoom and everybody at the Lava Center. Thank you to Vanessa and Lindy at the Lava Center holding down the live part of this.
Yes.
And please do go to echogreenfield.org to find out more about what we're doing. And please join that walking tour on October 9th.
Oh,
Meet at
okay.
1 p.m. in front of the Lava Center, 324 Main Street. If you have any other questions, you can always email Lindy at echogreenfield.org. And as Joan mentioned, the project director stays very busy with those kinds of outreach contacts to the community. So she's your contact point for this project. I think that's it then for today. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joan.
Yes, a round of applause.
Thank you.